Supposed biblical error. The trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Skeptics have claimed the trial of Jesus was a myth because it contained several historical errors. First, the Jews had no power to arrest Jesus. That was the job of Rome. The trial of Jesus happened at night, and the Sanhedrin were forbidden to hold trials at night. Trials could only be held in the temple, not the house of the high priest, or during Passover week. Nor would they have spit on or hit Jesus. There was a 24-hour waiting period before one could be sentenced, and Jesus' sentence happened rather quickly. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem was probably during the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, because the palm trees used on Palm Sunday were not in bloom in the spring during Passover. The charge of blasphemy doesn't make sense, because Jesus only claimed to be the Messiah, and it was only blasphemous to claim to be God, not the Messiah. So we'll go through these point by point. First, Rome did not run a nanny state or handle every administrative task. Due to the size of the empire and the practicality of governing large territories, they left several local levels of authority in play that reported back to Rome. Larry Overstreet says, generally speaking, Roman law allowed the local law of each province to be exercised without much interference. Wolfgang Kunkel says, local administration, the administration of justice as between the natives of the provinces, and many other tasks, were in general simply left to the political organs of the subject people. Josephus reports a later incident involving Jesus ben Ananias, who was prophesying against the temple. He was arrested and chastised, and then turned over to the Roman authorities, which is very similar to what happened to Jesus the Christ. So the arrest of Jesus does fit with the cultural context. The next 5 supposed errors are actually anachronistic. These are rules and customs that were from the Mishnah Sanhedrin, a work that dates to almost 200 years after the trial of Jesus. There is no evidence such rules were in place prior to 70 AD, which is really the earliest they could have been codified, after the destruction of the temple. Furthermore, even if these laws did predate 70 AD, there is no evidence the Sanhedrin kept these rules in a strict sense, and Josephus doesn't teach this was the case. In fact, he cites instances, like the execution of James, where Jewish leaders took advantage of loopholes to execute their plans and desires. In no sense can one suggest these rules were followed when James was murdered by the Jewish leaders. Robert H. Stein says, with regard to the legal prescriptions found in the Tractate Sanhedrin, it needs to be pointed out that these rules were written down after AD 200, and it is unclear whether they reflect rules that actually existed in Jesus' day, or whether they reflect an idealized description of what such laws should have been like. Second, some of these rules found in the tractate conflict with Josephus' description of how things were in the first century. Anthony Harvey agrees. It is far from certain that Mishnah laws were in force before the fall of Jerusalem, or even if they were, that they would have been observed in an emergency. William Wilson says, it is now certain that many of these rules were only idealistic and theoretical and do not reflect actual practice in any period. So there is no reason to think that Mishnah laws were in effect, and even if they were, Jewish leaders seemed to bend the rules to their pleasing when necessary and act in unethical ways. If they wanted to take care of Jesus quickly before he gained too much popularity, especially as Passover pilgrims were flooding Jerusalem, there was nothing stopping them. I hear this next objection more often than I should. It has even been used on a popular atheist website. But it is an odd objection, because palm leaves don't bloom. Palm flowers bloomed once a year, but the branches were available for use all year round. Plus, there wasn't a rule that a would-be Messiah could only have used palm branches during the Feast of Tabernacles. Finally, some have alleged that Jesus' conversation with the high priest must be a fabrication, because the high priest only asked if Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, which Jesus affirmed. But that was not a blasphemy claim, because the Jews did not understand the Messiah to be a divine figure, but a mere mortal king. However, Jesus not only affirmed he is the Son of God, a title for the Messiah, but he goes one step further and claims to be more than this. Craig Evans and Darrell Bock note that Jesus alludes to Psalm 110 and Daniel 7 to argue he was a divine being. Jesus refers to himself in Psalm 110 as sitting at the right hand of the Father in heaven, and then also refers to himself as a divine being from Daniel 7, known as the Son of Man, who rides on the clouds, is worshipped, and is given sovereign power over all people forever. Only God could ride the clouds in the Hebrew Bible, yet Jesus claimed this is who he is, in addition to being the Messiah. Even Bart Ehrman at least agrees the title Son of Man was referring to a divine figure. In Jesus' view, society, with all of its conventions, was soon to come to a screeching halt when the Son of Man arrived from heaven in judgment on the earth. So Jesus claimed to be the Messiah and divine in his response to the Sanhedrin. When they took him before Pilate, their motive was to get Jesus executed for this claim. But the Romans wouldn't have cared if some human claimed to be a god. So they highlighted Jesus' claim to be the Messianic king, which could have been construed as a challenge to Caesar Tiberius, son of the divine. Thus, when looking more closely at the Jewish and Roman context, Jesus' claim and the Sanhedrin's response fits very well with the cultural context. So Jesus' trial is hardly a problem, and fits quite well with the culture and customs from that time period. Thus, this supposed error can be resolved.